Hey everyone, coming at you today with part 2 of our 4-part kind of DPS summary, endgame meta PvE summary series. We talked about primaries already. Today we're going to talk about specials, and then we're going to talk about power and then ability damage in the coming days. So yeah, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with our outline. So first slide, we're going to talk about what are the criteria for a good special weapon when it comes to endgame PvE damage. We're going to talk about exotics because obviously when it comes to slot competition, exotics are really compared against exotics and legendaries are compared against legendaries. There's some crossover, but you know, when you're using an exotic heavy, for example, and that's dominating your playstyle and your kind of damage strategy, then you don't really have a choice. You can't really use an exotic special, right? So we'll compare them separately. And then toward the end in the summary slide, which I'm skipping ahead to a little bit, slide 8, we'll talk about where these kind of intersect and cross. And then there's 4 really relevant damage classes or, you know, weapon families when it comes to specials. Glaives are not really used for damage. So it's really going to be shotguns, snipers, fusions, and grenade launchers. Traces as well, not really used for boss DPS, right? So not really a consideration. And even, to be honest, some of these families, whether it's fusions or grenade launchers, not really that relevant for boss damage either, but at least potentially piquing some people's curiosity. So I did wanted to put them in there. And then we have, you know, slide 7, special cases. That's going to cover stuff like the rocket pulse, which I'm sure, you know, we're excited to talk about. So let's go ahead and move on to our criteria. So our criteria, you'll see here, a lot of this is similar to primaries, but we've added a couple variables. So range can matter, right? You don't want to be using snipers on a melee range boss for the most part. You don't really want to be using shotguns on a long range boss for the most part. And then you have crit percentage. You know, weapons like New Land Beyond are very crit demanding. Same thing with Lord of Wolves. And if you miss crits, kind of a big deal. You have DPS, just raw DPS, damage profile. Setup required, so redirection unvoiced comes to mind. Consistency, some weapons are less consistent to use than others. Rarity, which we talked about in the previous slide. We have total damage, which is a new one. Total damage, obviously not a factor for primaries, but for special weapons can definitely come into play. And then finally, swap potential, which is less relevant these days. We're really in a pump and dump kind of meta right now, where you don't really need to swap off your weapon, and the ability to like double slug or swap between 2 specials is not really that important anymore. So swap potential, it's there, it's on the table, but I'm not going to really talk about it too much outside of a few specific contexts, okay? Now that we're talking about specials are a little different compared to primaries, right? Primaries are fairly straightforward to compare, but I want you guys to remember one thing. So Outbreak and good SMGs with Temporal Blast, stuff like that, they're going to be hovering around the 2500 DPS value. So any special, I'm going to talk about a lot of specials today, and a lot of them are actually going to be sub 2500 or around 2500. So I want you guys to keep that in mind when it comes to, should I even be using a special if it's this bad when it comes to DPS? So let's go ahead. This is especially going to apply to some legendary. So let's go ahead and let's move on to the next slide where we're going to talk about exotics. So there's 8 exotics here. I basically took the top 8 exotics that are on my sustain tab, and I'm going to discuss them here. So first up, we have Lord of Wolves. Lord of Wolves, even after all this time, even after reserves got nerfed, by the way, guys, a little comment here. I know a lot of weapons received intentional/unintentional reserve changes in the Edge of Fate, and I want to talk about that, but putting it in this video would be too much to talk about. Obviously, there's also heavy weapons that need to be covered as well. So instead of covering that in my DPS summary, whether it's special or power stuff, I'm going to cover it in another video where I talk about why the Desert Perpetual Day 1 race was so different from every other contest race we've ever had when it comes to conditions, and why that may have influenced people and their feelings about the race. And so reserve nerf, right, which wasn't really discussed by Bungie for the most part, that was a big part of it. And I'm going to discuss it as part of that video instead. So if you guys are interested in my thoughts on that, just, you know, keep that in mind that that's on the horizon at some point. But regardless, sorry for the tangent, let's talk about Lord of Wolves. So Lord of Wolves, 4.7k DPS, very impressive stuff. This is with manual reloads as well, no rain of fire, no special stuff like that. 96k total damage, which anything hovering near the 100k mark is pretty remarkable, right? Anything 80k, 70k, 60k, pretty standard for like a high total special. When we're reaching into that 100k 6-digit mark, that's where you're really starting to see some truly great total damage. So this is with hipfire, including the ignition damage, you know, precision stuff. The only problem with Lord of Wolves, obviously, is that it's exotic, number 1. And number 2 is that you need to be close range, and it really kind of punishes you if you miss crits, right? So a boss that's rapidly moving around or a little bit out of reach, Lord of Wolves maybe not the best for that. Next, we have Merciless. Now, Merciless has seen kind of upshot through the rankings here. And the reason for that is because this season I have changed all of the stuff in the sustain tab to not include Rain of Fire and just be manual reloads for pretty much everything, right? There's almost no exceptions. And so Merciless before was kind of held back by this because a lot of these other weapons like Fourth Horseman and Lord of Wolves and weapons that basically are really good mag dumpers, but they're punished because their reload's a little slow, that was kind of being bypassed by Rain of Fire. But now that that's gone and a weapon like the Fourth Horseman is being forced to manually reload, you're going to see the DPS be lower than Merciless. Now, that being said, 50k total damage, not particularly amazing, right? Not great, especially in the current sandbox where a lot of the bosses that people are playing against in endgame, like for example, in Desert Perpetual, they have a lot of health, right? They have a lot of health, and Merciless is just going to be a way of dumping your energy ammo and just instantly running out. So Merciless not super relevant anymore in terms of just kind of endgame context. The DPS isn't crazy high, and of course the total damage is a little pitiful when it comes to exotic DPS. So yeah, and this of course also requires you to get 2 kills with Impetus. You get 1 kill, you reload, you shoot 7 shots, you shoot 1 shot and an ad, reload again, and then you dump, right? So that's how Merciless was tested for this specific timing data. Next up, we have Fourth Horseman. Fourth Horseman, really, to be honest with you, these days is there's like 2 places I can see it being used. Maybe in a backroast rotation for 1 mag dump, and also potentially just to kill mini bosses, right? Just as a burst option to kill mini bosses. But really, when it comes to like mainstay damage, I don't think Rain of Fire Horseman is particularly amazing anymore. There's a lot of options that have eclipsed this these days, so I thought I'd mention it here because it is, in fact, a top 8 DPS contender when it comes to exotics, but you can see its total damage at 36k, despite the fact that you get 4 full mags, even after the reserve nerfs, is not that great. It's not that great, right? Duality recently got buffed so that its pellet shots can trigger on black wings, and then you can stack up with the slug and just keep it going, and you can just keep refreshing your stack timer by getting repeated crits. And surprisingly, Duality's DPS is pretty solid at 3505, right? I mean, that's not that far behind Fourth Horseman, even though the Horseman is getting manually reloaded. And the total damage, of course, being like a slug hybrid, is going to be a lot higher than Horseman at 53k. So Duality, definitely not a terrible like backup DPS option, I suppose. But I mean, Lord of Wolves is same range, same slot, doesn't require any sort of pre-game when it comes to like on black wings and stuff like that. So definitely living in Lord of Wolves' shadow here. Next, we have New Land Beyond. Now, New Land Beyond, I think the big outlier here that's immediately going to draw your attention is the total damage at 163,000 plus, right? That is a crazy amount of total damage for this sandbox. I mean, some raid bosses basically have around that much health. So you're basically able to solo an entire raid boss's health bar with just New Land Beyond and its reserves. So this does assume you start at the master times 20 and you're sprint canceling and your rally barricade. So this is the most optimal way to use New Land Beyond with its catalyst. However, even if you dial it back and you start at 0 stacks and you don't sprint cancel, the total damage is around like 150k or something, so it doesn't even lose that much DPS if you're not using it super optimally, and it's still pretty good, right? The only concern with New Land Beyond really is that we're in a super spam meta right now, and New Land Beyond offers pretty pitiful super returns, and when it does damage, it is pretty reliant on you hitting crits, not really good for close range circumstances, so that's the only thing I'm going to say about New Land Beyond. I mean, 3400-ish DPS is still pretty solid, definitely a gap above primaries for sure, so pretty decent stuff, although I don't know. I mean, to be honest with you guys, something I haven't really mentioned is that exotics, a lot of them are kind of suffering right now because none of them can benefit from temporal armaments or a temporal blast, which is enough to give legendaries, or like at least the good legendaries, a leg up that's big enough that exotics kind of become irrelevant unless they have some sort of special function. For example, Parasite, which provides a worm byproduct, which then you can use to power a special of yours by 15%, a special that could very well be using temporal blast. So, it's kind of weird. Exotics are in a weird spot, but let's keep going. Still Hunt, bit of a fall off here, right? Total damage 71k, it's fine, right? 3361 DPS. I mean, that is worse than New Land Beyond, and this is with the requirement that you're on Hunter on Celestial Nighthawk. This also assumes that you're pre-popping and you're shooting right when damage starts, so pretty optimal. The only stuff here is you're not getting any orbs. I'm not assuming that you're dodge reloading or anything like that, all manual reloads, and you're not holstering either, right? So obviously you could use this a bit more optimal if you had like holsters and stuff, but then you're cutting into surges. I don't know. Still Hunt, that's a whole other discussion. In my opinion, though, it's not that great outside of swap stuff, right? But if you're using it as a sustained damage weapon, its time has definitely come and gone, right? It's definitely not very good anymore. I mean, New Land Beyond is just absolutely gapping this thing. Similar DPS values with no Nighthawk on New Land Beyond, and the total damage is just, I mean, that's just enough to make you blush, really. Okay, next up we got Slayer's Fang. A surprising pick here, honestly. I didn't expect Slayer's Fang to be this high, because Slayer's Fang doesn't even have like an intrinsic damage perk or anything. I mean, it has the weakened thing, it has like Knight's Horn Sight, which is cool. But yeah, Assault Mag includes some munitions. This doesn't even include Cascade Point, by the way, so you could proc Cascade Point with this thing, do a little bit more damage. Obviously, Shotgun Cascade or like Slayer's Fang Cascade is not as potent as something like GL Cascade, so it's not going to be as noticeable of a DPS increase, but it's still there. I didn't even include it in this option here. And yeah, the DPS is surprisingly pretty decent. What is even more surprising to me, though, is that it's higher than Choir of One. You know, Choir of One, projectile mode, used to be something that was thought of as like pretty solid for boss DPS, like as a backup. And now that I'm looking at its numbers here and comparing it to stuff like Duality and comparing it to stuff like Slayer's Fang, which I didn't really consider to be like a legitimate damage option. And Choir 1 really kind of, it's fallen off for sure, right? I mean, the total damage when you're hip firing it, 55k is nothing to write home about. And then 3100 projectile mode point blank, that is not very good, right? That is not very good. Just not amazing stuff from Choir, to be honest. I mean, the hit scan mode, obviously, like we said, most likely did in fact receive a buff. And so, yeah, that's going to have more total damage, but I mean, the DPS of that mode is obviously going to be lower and not enough to break top 8 here. So the main summary of this, I mean, we're going to go over the summary of exotics later on in the summary page as well, but Lord of Wolves is, and maybe New Land Beyond for some cases, but again, we talked about the super issue, Lord of Wolves is really the only standout when it comes to exotic special DPS, and then every other exotic special that I haven't mentioned here is either like a utility special, like, you know, Divinity or Navigate or something like that, and it like augments damage in some way, or it's just not relevant, like the DPS is just not high enough. I mean, even at the bottom end, you're seeing 3100 DPS, that's kind of encroaching into primary territory, right? Once you get down to 2500, 2600, that's where the competitive primaries start to emerge here. So really, you know, exotic specials and specials in general, you know, the top end is slowly increasing in power, but the bottom end, like stuff like the bad fusions, the bad shotguns, the bad snipers, and even the bad just exotic specials, they're kind of getting into primary territory, and there's like really no reason to use them. So definitely interesting stuff, but yeah, that's all I have to say about exotic specials. Let's go ahead and move on to our first of 4 legendary special families. That's going to be shotguns. Now, shotguns, keep in mind that number, 2500, around 2500 is the benchmark for a good primary. And you can see here, redirection on voice, 5100 DPS, pretty solid stuff. And what surprised me actually is that preloading unvoiced with max redirection stacks, so I think it's 15 shots with 30 stacks, actually grants it 72,000 total damage. And with 4 times a charm in honing rather than redirection in honing, unvoiced actually has a total damage value of 75,000. So very close together, except for the redirection value has much higher DPS for obvious reasons. Double damage perk with a 2 times boost on most of your shots. This is with reload canceling as well, which, you know, shouldn't make too much of a difference to most people using this shotgun. But yeah, I mean, the DPS is pretty high. Obviously, you know, the setup time and the setup cost, not dying, needing to pick up special bricks after you're done getting your stacks, unless you want to have like no shots going into damage. Obviously, all consequences that are very, you know, apparent. But I just thought I'd include the value here because unvoiced with redirection has been like a popular topic in the past. So yeah, you can see the DPS value is pretty high, but obviously very situational, very situational. Okay, next up we have Until Its Return with Overflow and Surrounded. Just think about this as like a surrounded rapid fire shotgun, right? You might use it in some cases. 3349 DPS and 42,000 total. Now that you're looking at some of these total values, you can see how legendary specials definitely suffer when it comes to total damage compared to something like an exotic special, but we'll talk about them more as time progresses. Now, I had to include a temporal blast option here, and the only shotgun that is new gear that's like relevant, which is, you know, not Percipial, because Percipial is a precision frame and doesn't really have any good damage perks, is going to be Pure Recollection. And Pure Recollection, even with temporal blast and the double damage perks of high impact reserves plus bait and switch and reload canceling every 2 reloads, it's going to end up with a DPS value of 3170 and a total damage value of 59,000, which is actually very disappointing, to be honest with you, for a weapon that uses temporal blast. Maybe if we got a rapid fire shotgun with temporal blast, things would be a different story, but shotguns don't really have a crazy high boss scaler, so it kind of makes sense that temporal blast isn't particularly amazing. Perfect Paradox, a classic option here, you know, 2447 DPS, total damage is going to be 43,000. This is with body shot, cast no shadows, trench barrel, melee reloads. Pretty classic option here for like Song of Flame users. I will say though, this might be kind of surprising that Perfect Paradox's DPS is encroaching on primaries, like good primaries, right? That's kind of interesting, I suppose. I was kind of surprised by that as well. I didn't realize just how strong primaries were becoming. But yeah, I'm saying, like even any special weapon, especially legendary special weapons that don't have some sort of specialist tech that allows them to gain an upper edge is really just going to be around the same as like the good primaries, right? Some of the bad specials. And it's crazy that I'm calling Perfect Paradox with Trench Barrel like a bad special, but in this context, it kind of is, right? Interesting stuff. Let's go ahead and talk about Found Verdict as well. I just wanted a comparison because people compare aggressives and rapids for Trench Barrel all the time. This is a relevant aggressive with Trench Barrel, Time Loss Magazine, Rewind Rounds. This is going to be 2427 DPS with a 49,000 total. So yeah, I mean, if you're interested in, you know, using Song of Flame with like an energy shotgun, try Found Verdict. The DPS is the exact same. The combination of Time Loss Magazine and Rewind Rounds means that you essentially never have to reload. So that's pretty cool as well. Shout out to Found Verdict. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about shotguns. I mean, for the most part, you're really not looking at the bottom half of this slide. The top half of this slide is like pretty niche. I don't know, dude. It's weird. It's a weird time for legendary specials that are not, you know, Mint Retrograde, right? I mean, that's pretty obvious, but we're going to talk about Mint Retrograde and why it's such a standout. I mean, I think everyone understands the subjective feeling of being like, oh wow, Mint Retrograde feels so good, or X and Y feels so good. But I'm here to obviously provide you the numbers and quantify exactly why legendary specials are in such an awkward position right now, especially if they're not new gear and temporal blast abusers. Next up, we have sniper rifles, our next slide. We have 5 snipers to talk about today. The top sniper is going to be Lance Ephemeral with Tactical Mag, FTTC 4 times, Honing times 5, and Network Targeting times 5. So it assumes you have 5 stacks of the Darcy buff. This thing has 3,800 DPS and a total damage value of 121,000. Now this is with Temporal Blast. Anytime you see a blue value here, that means I'm using Temporal Blast. Granted, Praetor's Revenge actually doesn't fall that short of Lance Ephemeral, even though it doesn't have Temporal Blast, and Praetor's Revenge, because of Time Loss Magazine, actually does do a little bit more DPS than Lance Ephemeral, which is kind of explains why their gap is not that large. Something surprising here is that Succession with full redirection stacks actually has pretty competitive DPS at 3,600 or so, with a total damage value of 64k. Granted, is that going to be something that's going to make it worth taking over the mint slot? Definitely not. But I'm just kind of surprising, I guess, that the DPS is as high as it is. You know, I guess that's the power of redirection, just having a double damage perk. For those of you wondering about Lance Ephemeral with redirection and like frame of reference, I have those numbers in the spreadsheet if you're curious, but they're not particularly like insane or mind-blowing because rapid fires, they run out of redirection way earlier into their reserves proportionally compared to something like an aggressive. And so with a lot of your mag, you're actually just not going to have any damage perk at all. So it kind of evens out over time if you're curious. We have Critical Anomaly and Fugue 55. I kind of just mentioned these because they are popular options. One of them is basically the equivalent of like a Recon Firing Line Succession, except for it has a better damage perk. And the other one is like a classic 4 times Charm Firing Line adaptive. And you can see here, like when we talk about, like I said, during the shotgun part, and I was like, yo, like you're comparing these against some of the best primaries in the game, and they're like not that much better, right? Like Critical Anomaly and Fugue 50, I mean, Fugue 55 is straight up worse than Outbreak at max nanites ramped. So, and this is with the Darcy buff as well. So you're really starting to see like the high-end primaries are basically power creeping over the bottom end of specials, which is like an interesting game balancing, I guess, question or like phenomenon. A lot of these outdated, I don't want to call them outdated because I mean, Critical Anomaly was just like a year ago, but you know, they're kind of falling behind because they don't have access to stuff like Temporal Blast and like new gear stuff. And I don't know, it's just weird. And then Outbreak, by the way, my Outbreak numbers, I totally forgot to mention this, by the way. I should put this in the pinned comment on my primary video, but in my previous video, none of those weapons even have the new gear bonus applied. So when you add the new gear bonus to something like an Outbreak, that's going to be even more DPS. That's going to eclipse even more legendary specials this season that don't have access to the new gear bonus or to Temporal Blast or, you know, all sorts of things like that. So yeah, pretty interesting phenomenon. Let's go ahead and move on next to the fusion rifle slide. Yeah, this one's a doozy. I mean, look at the bottom 4. Look at the bottom 4. These are all worse than Outbreak. They're all worse than Outbreak. Finite Maybe is worse than Outbreak. Techine Force is worse than Outbreak. Eremite, Axial Lacuna. I mean, I just put these all here because they're all examples of different archetypes. You have, you know, Rapid and Lionfish. You have Aggressive with Finite Maybe, Adaptive, High Impact, and Precision as you go down the list. And I mean, you can see the damage profiles if you're interested. You can see how high impacts are similar, but they're lower quality of life, but they have, you know, higher total damage. Precisions are just kind of the worst overall. Definitely a significant drop in DPS. And you can see how aggressives are like pretty similar to rapids, because I did put the rapid data 2157/44k in the kind of description row of the Lionfish if you're curious without Temporal Blast. But even with Temporal Blast, I mean, Lionfish is like, why would you ever use this gun over something like Mint? And maybe you haven't seen the Mint numbers yet, but I'll show you them and you're going to be like, oh my God, why would I ever use this gun over Mint? So I don't know, we're in a weird situation. Mint Retrograde, by the way. So the thing with Rocket Pulse, right? I'll talk about this more when we get to the special cases slide, but Mint Retrograde, right? Something that I thought it would be balanced around is content creators were saying, yo, we tried this new Rocket Pulse on the Edge of Fate preview build, And it's cool, but it runs out of ammo really fast. And I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So they're going to make it a lower total damage weapon with higher DPS. So what they ended up doing is they made it a higher DPS weapon that does so much damage per shot that the total damage just eclipses not only legendary specials, but legendary heavies as well. So when we get to that slide, I'm talking without Temporal Blast as well. Without Temporal Blast, without New Gear bonus, just the base model of the archetype does better than everything else in its slot, right? In both departments. And it's a ranged weapon too. So it's not even like it's not even like a shotgun where you can say, oh, it makes sense that they're trading it off because you have to be within melee range. You don't. It can be like basically in a range, right? So interesting, right? We're going to talk about that. Okay, next up, grenade launchers. This is practically like an irrelevant slide. Wilderflight, that top row there, the only one that's even remotely close to being relevant, that's with slide shot. It's with slide shot, frenzy, spike grenades, and it's simulated. This assumes you have perfect slide timings. You're shooting at max fire rate. You're shooting at the archetype's max fire rate, essentially, indefinitely, which is just not sustainable and kind of dumb looking. And if you're going to do slide shot and go quirky with it, just use a rocket. It's like, don't use it. Don't use a breach GL. It's not that good. I mean, even with slide shot and going crazy and sliding around and stuff, I mean, the DPS value is still worse than some of the top performing specials in some of the weaker families. And we haven't even gotten to talking about mint yet. When we get to mint, your mind, I mean, you probably already know this, but your mind is going to be blown, right? It just absolutely destroys everything else on all of these slides, really, as a legendary weapon. Okay, anyways, Theodolite. Micro missiles are not actually impacted by Temporal Blast that much because they don't get one Temporal Blast projectile per shot, right? It takes every other shot. So the DPS actually doesn't go up that much. It's like 2486, DPS and 69,000 total. Implosion rounds, recon, honing. And you can see here on the side, 1831, 51k without temporal. That's not a huge increase compared to what we're used to seeing on some of these other weapons. Wild style, 1702, 46k. I mean, this is just manually reloading, spamming a double fire. And then lightweights, you can see how pathetic lightweights are. I mean, like, come on, 1104? There's like, I'm pretty sure Tommy's matchbook is better. Like, oh my god. Anyways, I'm not gonna rant about lightweight grenade launchers. Finally, the one thing that I will say about this slide that is actually remarkable, which we'll talk about in the summary, is Festival Flight, actually. Festival Flight, low-key... Okay, you know what? I just realized I should probably include the non-temporal numbers for Festival Flight so you can see how much it benefits from Temporal Blast. So, I'll call to the editor. Yo, editor Aegis, take care of this. Wow, look at that. The information magically appeared in the row. Anyways, like I was saying, Festival Flight is kind of remarkable, actually, right? The DPS value without Temporal Blast is going to be 575. With Temporal Blast, it nearly doubles, right, to 1025. So basically what I'm saying is Festival Flight, if you just shoot it, every round of rotation of whatever you're doing, you get a free, essentially, 1,000 DPS increase to whatever you're doing. 1,000 is a lot. For like a take damage source, that's like more than a Finality's Augur turret, which is like a heavy weapon, which, its specialty is doing tick damage. So Festival Flight, I mean, we're going to talk about this in summary page, but yeah, pretty important to make sure your area denial user is in fact on Festival Flight and not on a different area denial in order to make use of this pretty substantial DPS increase. There are exotic primaries out there that do lower DPS than Festival Flight with Temporal Blast and Honing ×5. So pretty impressive, and then obviously the total damage is going to be very high because it's an area denial. So 123k, 69k without Temporal. Next, we're going to move on to our little special cases slide where we have 3 potential candidates to talk about here. Let's start with the first one, the most notorious of them all, Mint Retrograde. Mint Retrograde, my dear friend. Rewind rounds, Bane Switch, Honing, whatever suits your fancy. I guess most people would probably pick Honing. Now, without Temporal Blast, this thing already has, I'll show it on screen, better total damage and DPS than an equivalent heavy jail. So I'm talking Outrageous Fortune, kind of the best in slot heavy jail when it comes to DPS this season. Without Temporal Blast, this thing does more total damage and higher DPS than an Envious Bait and Switch Spike Grenade's rapid fire grenade launcher. Okay, I want that to sink in. DPS and total, not just DPS and total. And the total is quite sizable too, the difference. Okay? And then with Temporal Blast this season, 4775 DPS, 85k total. That is the equivalent of using a rocket with Cluster Bomb and Bait and Switch or Honing, double perk rocket, and just spamming that with Galley. And it's a legendary special. Okay, so look at this damage profile, 4775 DPS, 85,000 total. I want you to maybe pause the video and you go back and compare this to every other legendary special in this presentation. Okay, at least in the DPS front, nothing is even close outside of like Redirection on Voice, which again has its own kind of situational problems. And then 85k total is also, again, very, very high for a non-4 times a charm legendary special weapon. Insane stuff. Like every single legendary special weapon when it comes to DPS is living in Mint Retrograde's shadow right now. okay? So that's kind of the situation that we're in. And then obviously, even just ignoring Mint Retrograde, if that didn't even exist, the bottom half of all of these slides, or sometimes the full slide really, it's just irrelevant. It's just irrelevant compared to like exotic primaries or even just primaries with like peacekeepers and stuff. We're in a weird state. We're in a weird state is what I'm saying, okay? The other two exotics here, I kind of just have them for fun, right? I just didn't want Mint to be lonely, right? Mint's just kind of chilling at the top. And I didn't want the slide to be empty, okay? So I brought it two friends to talk about, even though they're not that remarkable, right? Euphony, starting at 0 stacks, no threat of evolution, but including the threadling damage, 86k total, right? So decent total damage. I mean, see, I say decent. It's the same as Mint with Temporal, bro. Like it's just the DPS is so much worse, and like, you know, like it's just hard to talk about stuff that, you know, and Mint Retrograde is right there, you know, like Euphony in another universe, like last patch, like 86k total, that's like pretty good. That's pretty good. 37 DPS, that's pretty decent as well. You know, that's okay. It's okay, right? But we're just in a patch right now where, you know, Outbreak is doing 2500 without the new gear bonus, and Mint Retro is doing almost 5k DPS, right? I don't know, insane stuff, okay? And then Dead Messenger. Dead Messenger, I only thought I brought it up here because, you know, the triple wave thing is kind of cool. Waveframes are a terrible archetype for base boss DPS, but because this thing now shoots 3 waves and it has basically an infinitely refreshable 30% damage buff, you know, with the fundamentals, it's okay. Like, you could maybe use it on bosses that have multiple copies, like Graniques or something like that. So I just thought it's something interesting that I wanted to bring people's attention to because for those that don't know, if you look at the spreadsheet right now, Dead Messenger actually has the exact same damage profile as Microcosm. And I know the casual community in Destiny loves Microcosm. They like talk about the weapon all the time, and it's like a good reference point, I guess, because people, the same amount of attention that they give to Microcosm, I feel like they could look over and be like, yo, Dead Messenger has the exact same damage profile if you're shooting all 3 waves like at a boss. So that's kind of interesting. It's a good reference point, I guess, to talk about. It's more so an indictment of how bad Microcosm is in the grand scheme of things, in reality, in the current sandbox, compared to, you know, how good Dead Messenger is, really. But, you know, I thought I'd put that out there. Okay, let's talk about the summary. So I've been talking about the sandbox and saying how a lot of legendary specials are bad. Here's the summary, okay? Here's the basics. Here's the basics. There's like only 4 special weapons that you really need to care about in this current sandbox when it comes to DPS, okay? Number 1 is the default. This is the guy you should be taken everywhere, okay? Everywhere. Ammo economy is great. Ammo generation is strong. Ad clear, amazing. Dealing with majors, amazing. Dealing with bosses, amazing. It'll make you a sandwich, right? Like, this thing is insane. It's great. It's amazing. I don't know what to tell you. It's amazing. No other special even comes close once new gear bonus is factored in. Temporal Blast makes this essentially a ranged Lord of Wolves with better consistency. Agree. Whoever wrote that, very intelligent. Bacchus, second row. The only reason I bring this up is because in speedrunning and maybe in some optimal situations, there's new multiplicative stackers in Destiny 2, and I'm sure they're going to add more. It seems like the dev team or the game direction team is kind of interested in bringing this, reigniting this flame, right? We used to have exotic effects that would stack multiplicatively on top of surges and stuff, and then they converted all of them into ×4 surge sources, and now they're kind of going back on that, giving Bacchus, for example. Well, I guess they started with Sanguine technically, but Sanguine, and then Bacchus, and then of course Path of Burning Steps, which hasn't really gotten a lot of attention, but maybe I'll give it some attention with some DPS stuff later this season. But yeah, Bacchus is probably the most remarkable of them. It has 4 10% multiplicative stacking bonuses, which we'll talk about at some point in another video. But yeah, Lord of Wolves is boosted by Bacchus. It's the only non-stasis arc weapon to be boosted by Bacchus. And yeah, it also happens to be one of the best specials in the game right now for DPS. So yeah, great for dumping after heavy, blah, blah, blah. You know, all the stuff I say in the notes here. But the real thing is I just wanted to talk about Bacchus because, you know, it goes well with Bacchus. That's all I wanted to say. Next up, we have total damage. I mean, New Land Beyond has to take the crown here. I mean, it's just, the total damage is too much to ignore. The DPS isn't even bad. It's not even bad. It's like, what, like 3,500 or something? It's not even that bad. The only thing with New Land Beyond, like I mentioned before, poor super generator and very strict precision requirement. If you miss a crit or if you die, God forbid, if you die, you know, you're going to lose out on a lot of damage and damage uptime. But yeah, once you get the catalyst rolling, I mean, this thing is it's a treat, right? A lot of total damage, great total damage. I will say though, like with how boss phases are designed in Desert Perpetual right now, it doesn't really tend to be super relevant. I mean, maybe you might use it for like, you know, breaking eyes or something like that. Like the total damage, very ammo efficient special, for example. Yeah, like for breaking eyes on Corregos or something like that. But on most bosses, it's just like, you know, you'd probably rather use something else in Retrograde. So, so there's that. And then finally, we have tick sources, right? Just make sure your area denial user is on Festival Flight and they're not on Psychopomp or on Lost Signal or on Baton or any of these other areas. Just make sure they're on Festival Flight, because Festival Flight literally provides like double the damage of the others because it has access to Temporal Blast. Okay, so just make sure you're using Festival Flight. Free 1k DPS, 1k DPS on top of whatever else you're doing. That's like 20% more damage for most damage. Like 5k DPS in this sandbox, pretty good. Thumbs up. And Festival Flight adds 1k on top of that. So let's say you're doing, I don't know, exotic heavy DPS or exotic special DPS with like Lord of Wolves or something, and you're outputting 5k. If you just stop every once in a while to just dump a little Festival Flight into the boss, you're doing an additional 1k on top of that, which is again 20% more for most damage strategies that are hovering around 5k or lower. So pretty good. Just make sure, communicate with your team if you're really like optimizing damage and be like, yo, who's using Area Denial? Just like make sure you're on Festival Flight with Temporal Blast, because that shit is pretty strong. Okay, that is all I wanted to say for today. I love all of you guys. Hope you guys have enjoyed this little foray into special weapon investigation. We're going to talk about power weapons, which are also in a kind of like an awkward spot right now, I would say. But yeah, we're going to talk about power weapons in a wee bit in tomorrow's video. And yeah, that's it for now. We're also updating the boss health spreadsheet for those of you that are avid followers of that one. It's almost completely updated. So for those of you that are interested in how much health bosses have after the number crunch, almost every boss is correct right now. We have maybe 2 or 3 that we need to go back and fix, but almost everything else is done. So take a look at that if you're interested. Also, I totally forgot to say this at the start of the video, but I don't know, check out my stream, I guess. A lot of people apparently are not aware that I stream on Twitch and YouTube. If you have any questions about my videos and you want to get my reaction like in the moment or something more verbose than like a comment or something like that, feel free to drop by. And I also stream like speedrun practice, speedrun strat development, and a lot of damage testing. I don't think anyone streams damage testing as much as I do on D2, Twitch, and YouTube. So yeah, that's about it. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys around. Thanks for watching.